rhetoric as Marine Le Pen does, which is of course silly because you do not fight a political party by adopting its agenda. Nevertheless, what I want to stress here is that what used to be fringe politics, fringe groups, are now becoming, if not mainstream, at least influential, especially among young people. When you look at the figures of the vote for Marine Le Pen at the 2017 national election, the election for the presidency, what you can see is a breakthrough in among voters aged from 18 to 24 and aged between 24 and 35. It used to be this segment of the population who did not want to vote for the extreme right. And now they're really achieving a breakthrough. And the reason is especially this feeling of, we say, alienation with immigration in the multicultural society. Not all young people do vote for the National Front. Those with the lower education do, those with the lower social status do, those with the lower income, but among unemployed youngsters and young people who belong to the working class, the lower middle class, we do have a real problem with these anti-immigration policies, which are becoming, I would say, common sense when you talk with the younger generation. So, once again, this is a remarkable achievement by the identity movement, because once again it's a very small movement of activists, not politicians, who do not want to have their agenda succeed in the polls. There are people who fight on the streets. There are people, you can find them in demos against the pension scheme reform that's now being passed by the French government. They are really people who do not believe in politics, but try to act, to be a vanguard to the extreme right and put up ideas that are becoming more and more mainstream and that are really changing what the extreme right is. I know that in Germany, for example, there may be another speaker will talk about this later on, but in Germany, I think that the identity movement has also a sizable impact. It's not a mass movement, but it's something that has to be contended with. In Austria, they also have an identity movement that is quite strong. Once again, it's quite strong, it's between 500 and 1,000 people. But nevertheless, I wanted you to have some knowledge of this movement, because I think in the years to come, it will be one of those right-wing, extreme right movements that will probably be at the forefront of anti-immigration policies.
Thank you very much, coming from this very interesting thoughtful lecture. And now our last speaker of the first panel is my colleague Eva, who will take a more theoretical approach. The title of her presentation is Populism versus Liberalism.
So I am reading my lecture, my speech. Populism is offensive these days. There is a kind of perplexity as to what we should do with the success of populism. I think that this offensive cannot be considered independent of what we are witnessing today in the field of populism research. It is clear that criticism of populism today is not formulated on the part of philosophy. Already at the 1967 conference, Isaac Berlin claimed that populism does not fit into the framework of a comprehensive theory. This has remained an admitted opinion on populism. Analyses meant to be scientific and unbiased are carried out by the so-called empirical sciences. The field that is primarily dominating populist research today is political science. Sociology is also researching the phenomenon, applying the powerful secularization theory to analyze populist propaganda. In addition to not having a philosophical perspective, present-day populism research is characterized by a further ignorance. It is widely and mainly implicitly accepted that it is pointless to raise the question whether populism has any ideological familiar similarity with fascism and Nazism on a theoretical level. At the same time, however, populism found its way into philosophy. The philosophical pro-populist self-definition was formulated by left-wing populism, most importantly by Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. Mouffe makes it clear that her primary reference point source is Carl Schmitt. As Mouffe writes, the most radical challenge to liberalism, so understood, is found in the work of Carl Schmitt. She also writes, in another place, the concept of the political was originally published in 1932, but Schmitt's critique is more relevant now than ever. The influence of the political philosopher Carl Schmitt is decisive in the self-definition and interpretation of populism nowadays, with both right and left-wing populism being associated with him as the closest precursor. The French Alain de Benoist, the leading philosopher behind the European New Right movement, has published several books on Schmitt as a key figure in the present-day political thinking. Schmitt is one of the most frequently cited authors by journalists when interpreting the success of populism. Schmitt is also often mentioned in America as the most important thinker behind Trump's policy. And I quote, the 20th century political theorist is now fodder for editorials in The Atlantic, The New Statesman, The Financial Times, and the London Review of Books. The irony of the situation presently is that it is populism itself that has shown an interest in creating a philosophical theory by mainly relying on Carl Schmitt, who is undoubtedly one of the most prominent figures in 20th century political thinking, but whose commitment to Nazism is also undeniable. The adoption of Schmitt without barely any criticism by contemporary populism clearly indicates that there is a connection between Nazism and present-day populism. The lack of a philosophical perspective, neglecting his relation to Nazism, are, in my view, linked to an earlier episode, namely that Jürgen Habermas, the central figure in liberal thought, has declared Schmitt's philosophical reception illegitimate. He argued that Schmitt's philosophical interpretation necessarily leads to a Schmittian position. Habermas, for his part, essentially made Schmitt's philosophical reception a taboo subject. I quote, Habermas asserts that if questions of justice cannot transcend the ethical self-understanding of competing forms of life, and if existentially relevant values, conflicts, and oppositions must penetrate all controversial questions, then in the final analysis we will end up with something resembling Carl Schmitt's understanding of politics. So what is my aim with populism in the long run? In agreement with Mouffe's earlier quotation that the only 30-page long the concept of the political is the key text to our age, I would like to construct a philosophical criticism of populism in a philosophical comparison with Schmitt. As a personal detour, I would like to note that I have been dealing with Schmitt for over 2 decades. I consider his thinking an inevitable challenge for those who are committed to individual freedom. The philosophical criticism of populism that I wish to formulate does not shy away from the exploration of the common roots of Nazism and populism. It must be done, even though the political consequences are obviously very different. And today there is clearly no dictatorship to such a degree with mass murders or physical abuses. Schmitt's contemporary influence, in my view, is related to the fact that Schmitt does not simply apply some ideological structure in his writings, nor does he repeat the key thesis of a particular ideology on and on. It is not the ideology of racism that binds Schmitt to Nazism. Schmitt's most important works of his key Weimar period are completely void of the element of racism. Schmitt formulated an existential philosophically based theory for the justification of power. And it is precisely this that binds him to Nazism. The basis for justifying power in the existential philosophical dimension, the basis for justifying power is the existential philosophical dimension in his works. And what is the aim of this presentation? First, I will provide a critical summary of how I see the situation in the 2 main fields of populism research, political science and political philosophy, which are dominated primarily by left-wing populism. Then I will briefly describe the philosophical direction that might be suitable for the criticism of populism. As far as the current state of populism research is concerned, I believe that both fields, political science and political philosophy, represent views that are actually common in populism. These views are the following: the acceptance of the idea of direct democracy, both fields identify populism as satisfying a social need that is considered it to be more or less reactive. Another common feature is the identification of the liberal attitude of individual freedom as hostile. This latter aspect is represented in left-wing populism by the polemical hostile stance against methodological individualism. It seems to be that in both fields the legitimacy of the principle of direct democracy is not viewed for directly, substantively, but rather appears on the backwaters of the methodological premise of the concept of the collective. In the case of political science, I primarily think of the assumptions solidified as a result of Canavan, to which Carl Mütter is strongly attached today. Mütter is one of the most influential populist scholars whose theses are widely accepted not only by political science literature in empirical research, but are also often echoed by the media. This acceptance greatly limits the room for the criticism of populism. In fact, both approaches, so political science and political philosophy, take populist speech as their starting point, and I believe rightly so. Political science considers the central element of populist speech to be fixed content-wise, defining it as an ideology, the essence of which is the opposition of the people and the elite. Because political science employs an empirical approach in the analysis of these speeches, it follows that there is a tendency to identify the content of ideological speech evidently and implicitly as factual. It assumes that the criticism of the elite is directed against the actual power elites, while the unified people and direct democracy also emerge as an opportunity for realistic practice, as a legitimate counteraction against the abuse of power and deficits linked to the current liberal system. So, thus, the paradoxical result of this methodological approach is that while leftist movements are portrayed as carriers of populism, at the level of thesis, the key elements of right-wing populism are echoed: the legitimacy of illiberal democracy and the force of liberalism as the cause of populism. Populism being a legitimate demand in response to the force of populism. Populism being a legitimate demand in response to the force of liberalism. So liberalism can be blamed for the demand for populism. The serious methodological problem with the empirical approach to populist speech is that it doesn't deal with the problem of what happens when someone intentionally manipulates others, when we are faced with lying. There is no methodological self-reflection on these questions in political science, but it is characterized by a kind of empirical confidence. As far as left-wing populism in political philosophy is concerned, the situation here is much more differentiated, more abstract and profound. Populist political philosophy is closely linked to Carl Schmitt. Laclau openly remarks that speech is accompanied by ambiguities, obscurities, paradoxes, but apparently it is not something that he believes needs clarification. On the contrary, he considers it a positive, worthwhile thing. he writes, the impossibility of fixing the unity of a social formation in any conceptually graspable object leads to the centrality of naming and constituting that unity. That was a quote. Conceptual obscurity is a necessary prerequisite for assuming the notion of the collective, which is the essence of populism and the associated notion of collectivist violence. The assumption of the collective sort of grows in by itself when we rely on ambiguities and paradoxes in speech. For Laclau, this dynamic is represented by the concept of anti-markers, floating markers. We may also say that we are witnessing the normative justification of lying in Laclau. However, in addition to the conceptual justification of lying, there is also an important positive development. Mouffe and Laclau are doing great service to the potential philosophical critique of populism, for which we should be grateful. They lay out the cards, they clearly state that what populism is, and they also tell us what might be the weak point, the Achilles heel of populism. I detect positive developments in two directions. First, following in the footsteps of Schmitt, the deep dimensions of human existence that I also consider important, I included the libidinal and the agonal dimensions, that is the aspects of sexuality and love on the one hand, and violence and hostility on the other. Second, the position which is capable of calling into question populism is called methodological individualism. It can explain the origin of the concept of the collective from the perspective of the individual. That is what Laclau says. And I mean that this leads to the conclusion that the clarification of the status of ambiguities and paradoxes can be the way of the critique of populism. The real threat for populist theory would be to tackle its Achilles' heel and construct such a methodological individualistic theory. Unfortunately, no such methodological individualistic theory is available. As long as this philosophical deficit, the lack of such methodological individualistic theory persists, the margin of theoretical legitimacy for populism is ensured. Finally, I believe there is a need for an existential normativist theory. Antagonistic tensions and paradoxes can be identified at the level of our particular personal activity, not outside and beyond our own activity. Now, to briefly illustrate the existential philosophical methodological individualistic criticism of populism that I propose, I would like to highlight a very important topic, that is the question of lies. To give an example, Nazism and present-day populism have lied similarly about how many people were present in their events. At the Torchlight demonstration after Hitler's election to Chancellor, at Trump's inauguration, or at the Orban demonstration where 2 million people were said to be present at a square which can hold 70,000. Of course, you can chase after specific lies and reveal that there were not as many people there as they say. But if we stay on the outer level, on the surface of the factual content of these false statements, we will misunderstand it all. When we identify populism as a lie, we must not focus on counterfactual statements, but on the fact that there is a positive assumption of validity here, which is an alternative to our original concept of validity. If we get stuck in arguing about the truth content of each lie and don't see the resolute structure behind it for the person to assert him or herself in this lie, we will not understand the essence of populism. So we should observe the self-assertion of the untrue existence that lies behind it, which is able to organize itself in every situation in action. A research that was begun by Jean-Paul Sartre and Erich Fromm in the late 30s, when they were faced with Nazism, should be carried out. The theory that takes account of antagonism implies that we must explicitly consider the ability to engage in violence to originate from the decisions of the concrete individual. That is to say, we need to create a normative concept of violence. Violence here does not only mean direct physical violence, but also violence that occurs in the workplace, in gender relations, or in child rearing, for example. Violence is associated with the gesture of crossing the border, which is, above all, overcoming the inherent inhibition within ourselves. We must symmetrically bear the burden of our own existence with all its difficulties and life-threatening effects, while others do likewise. To be able to use violence, I need to give up this principle of symmetry in advance. Two people, the perpetrator and the victim, are not enough to commit an act of violence. Additional accomplices are needed in the background. So, for example, sexual violence is also facilitated by his clinging to other accomplices. In the lie speech supporting violence, the individual continually speaks of the paradoxes of his or her own existence as a threat to him or herself, and asserts on the other side the fixed a priority in this connection, be it a particular person, leader or enemy, or the collective. If we look at the level I recommend, the common points between the past and the present become visible, no matter how painful it may be. This way of lying was already present in Nazism, fascism, and communism. We seem to be starting to forget the past.
Well, thank you very much, Eva, for this wonderful lecture. And now, discussion time. I would like to remind you that this coffee break that is going to happen soon is going to be a short one, and the next coffee break this afternoon is going to be a longer one, so that you can prepare yourself for that. So questions, remarks, in case anyone would like to say something.
I do have a short question and then a short comment / question. The first question is for the first speaker, and I'm sorry I'm wanting to pronounce your name because I don't want to butcher it. But I was very interested by your speech. I was just wondering why call it tribalism and not nationalism? Because most of what you described would apply to nations as well. And I was wondering why give the tribe such a bad name and not apply it to the nation, for instance. So that would just be my short question. And for Evagado, thanks a lot for your presentation. I would just like to challenge for a minute the idea that Carl Schmitt is a central figure for left populism. It seems to me that this is a strange reading of some of the work and some of the social movements. I think within the social movements, maybe theoretical thinkers are not read that much, actually. What matters are more past historical experiences. And there, the Nazi regime is obviously not the reference. The reference is very often like Latin American populism, the populist party in the United States, but so experiences that have nothing to do with Carl Schmitt. And on the theoretical level, it seems to me that within the work of Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, the first reference is not Carl Schmitt. Their first reference, their main source of inspiration is rather Antonio Gramsci. And when it is about building coalitions, bringing together different social reivindications, they insist on hegemony and on Gramsci, not on Schmitt. They use Schmitt, and their use is very debatable, but when they use Schmitt, it's mostly as a criticism of liberalism. And that's in some very specific texts, on, be it in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, or in the master book from Ernesto Laclau on Populist Reason, Schmitt is barely mentioned at all. So it seems that Schmitt is just used very specifically in some places, and maybe misused, but that would be another debate. But so therefore, I would want to push you a bit further on why you think that he's so central, because it doesn't seem that in the text he's so central. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. Thank you. Any other question, maybe remarks?
Yes, to the first speaker, my question is, what is the relation between the leaders and the voters? Because you focused on the voters, and I think you are basically right, or I have no reason to contest this, but isn't the concept of populism more valid for analyzing the kind of political strategy and leadership claims? Yeah. So to the second speaker, I'm interested. Maybe there is some kind of controversy between both of you, because you spoke on what you refer to as a new right, and I agree with that. And the question then is populism helpful for understanding the new right? Because it's a kind of a goat's cake, yeah, for the new right, or what the Germans say, Selbstverharmlosung, you know, like Kubitschek. So to give a public appearance that is not as dangerous as the new right would be, or the identity movement. And a last question, or just in addition to your argument, I think in Carl Schmitt you have not a void with regard to racism, because in the book or in his text on the political, he refers to the other and to the enemy, the foreigners, yes, as enemies, and they are strictly spoken the others. Yeah, but then my my problem with Laclau and Mouffe is, I have a lot of problems with them, but one of the things, and I think that what is the service they do for our debate? They do not say anything about the point, when the point is reached by hegemony. Imagine, they argue you reach the point of hegemony. That means the new right would be hegemonic and would construct the nodal point. That means, how to say, replacement is more or less the basic ideology of our society, yeah, or something like that, you know. And then the argument they have is, okay, this is only for, yeah, how long will it last? They never speak about the concrete, real effects of such a nodal point, you know, because the hegemonic point may be a second, or maybe last 10 or 12 years. But meanwhile, millions and millions of people can die. And afterwards, you have again a kind of fluid, dispersive practice and the construction of a new hegemonic strategy. But what happened with all the people? Because they never spoke about the excluded, the victims, yeah, of all these processes. You know. Do you know what my problem is? Do you understand what my problem is?
You should explain a bit more. I think I understand.
Okay. No, the temporal aspect in their idea of constructing hegemony is not an aspect. What are the social impacts on the everyday life of people? Imagine Le Pen would be successful constructing its discourse, its discursive claims. And the great replacement would be the kind of an empty signifier of all attitudes and all actions in our society. This has material consequences for a lot of people, yeah? Because then people would be expelled, maybe killed, yeah, and so on. And they never speak about these, how to say, unsympathetic aspects of discursive practice, you know? So it's completely avoided to speak about these things. Yeah, it's always on the level of discourse and change of discourse, hegemonic, and the next hegemony, and so on. So, you know, this is the way how they use Carl Schmitt. In a way, is in my eyes senseless, because for them, they starting with Gramsci and antagonism, and they use Carl Schmitt to say, oh, antagonism would be too bad, so let's have agonism, you know. So, but this is a kind of a, how to say, a smooth form of antagonism. But what is the consequence of agonism, you know? Because how it is in Germany, you know, we have now 200 people killed by right-wing groups, you know, in the last 20 years, yeah, 30 years. I mean, you know, for those people, it has really a serious consequence, you know. Okay, sorry, it's too long, but more
Thank you very much. Very important questions. The last question appears from Lars-André.
Okay, this question goes to Peter. You talked about, you mentioned that tribalism is more natural than democracy. And on the face of it, it seems like a surprising statement. Because after, I mean, I think I know what you mean. Perhaps you mean that tribalism is more primitive than when it comes first in time.
Or ancient.
Yeah, that's more ancient, yes. But politically, it sounded to me that you also meant to say that tribalism is more natural in a political sense. And you even said that democracy is an artificial construct, or it's artificial compared to tribalism. And once again, on the face of it, it's surprising because after all, when we thought that history came to an end, we didn't think that it came to an end with tribalism. That we went back to nomadic tribes living in splendid isolation from each other, and this is the end of history. This is what humanity was striving for all along. So no, we pretty much agree that what if history would come to an end, or will come to an end, it will have to come to an end with democracy. Unfortunately, it didn't happen 30 years ago, but perhaps it will happen when populism is over. So that seems to indicate that there is nothing more natural than democracy, at least to our present conception, according to our present conception. So this is why I found it a bit surprising. I would happily agree with you that democracy is not nearly as natural as we would like to think, but this is not the popular conception.
Thank you, very interesting question, Jan.
Really quickly for Jean-Yves, so you mentioned that the identitarians in French is not only a French movement, they see themselves as European, there's a transnational dimension to it. And at the end of your talk, you made a parallel with the situation in the US, where white nationalists and supremacists use the language of the Great Replacement. And so in the US, it seems to me that the term that is given to this new movement is the alt-right. And I was just wondering if you would go as far as saying as this, the US alt-right is exactly the same thing as the new right in Europe, or the identitarian? And if so, what's behind this sort of convergence, the transatlantic convergence?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask for the microphone. The speakers to be staying seated. I would like to ask them to take their answers short, and I would like to send the following Peter Giva.
Thank you much for the very good questions. I'm practically elaborating right now a paper, working on a paper on this topic, and I really appreciate all comments, especially these are such thoughtful. Regarding tribalism, why not nationalism? My response would be related to your question as well. I do think that, and why, let me explain first what I meant by natural. By natural, I do not mean that it's something, let's say, better, something more efficient, something that is let's say, closer to reality in the sense that it has a stronger connection to anything that is practical. I mean by that it's more ancient, and history has a longer history. So what we know about what were the political formations in earlier times, I think it was definitely, at least at the very beginning of the mankind, was closer to some kind of tribal politics. And my initial point, I did not have time to explain it here, is evolutionary psychology, in the sense that evolutionary psychology says that let's say, in order that tribes survive, it's a so-called social dominance theory, social dominance orientation theory. In order that tribes could survive, they had to formulate some kind of hierarchical structure. If there were no hierarchical structure, then they couldn't go successfully in a fight with each other, they couldn't collect and distribute resources, they couldn't suppress the level of violence within their own tribes. So from that respect, I think this kind of tribal logic, authoritarianism, plus this understanding of politics of war is more ancient. It has some evolutionary roots. And also there are some other social psychologists such as Touchfell, who says that we have this inherent born feature of differentiating between us and them. It resonates a bit to Carl Schmitt's thinking, but it doesn't have any kind of moral component. It's just a descriptive component. So that's what I mean when I say it's a bit more ancient. And I think that yeah, democracy from a civilizational perspective, is definitely a more developed stage of political system than tribalism. I think civilization is, by the end of the day, and civilization development is about progress. So, but when some civilizational norms becomes weaker, because, for example, the political class does not necessarily agree in some kind of unwritten rules of democracy, that you don't go and defeat your enemy with every tools possible, then I think politics can easily, let's say, go back to this more ancient form. And because it's more ancient, it can be, I think, more attractive to many. And that's what I meant by that. And why not nationalism? Because nation states are pretty new. But we can claim, of course, that nationalism also builds on this kind of inherent differentiation between the us and them. So, but I think tribalism, I mean, by using the word tribal, we can bring back this evolutionary perspective, which I think is rather relevant here. And for your question, which was about I totally agree with your question, because I think that populism is a good description of a rhetorical and political style aims to achieving the power and maintaining the power in an environment where the norm is that you have to be democratic. So it's, to a certain extent, it's a mask that everyone has to use if they want to grab the power in a democratic environment. Otherwise, they can be labeled fascist Nazis and can be dissolved by the authorities. So it's definitely a good description on, as I said, the rhetorical style and the mobilizational style, but it translates into something other in the, let's say, attitudes of the voters, something that I think tribalism probably describes better.
Thank you for the questions. I think they concern the same point, actually. The relationship of Laclau and Carl Schmitt, and I agree with you that racism is present in the concept of the political as the non-normative concept of the political. But it is not a racism as an anti-Semitism or as a biologism. Racism is stated on a philosophical level. That's what I meant. It is not ideologically based, an ideological racism by Carl Schmitt. And I think that is a key point, referring the relationship of Laclau and move to Carl Schmitt. On a theoretical level, if they accept the non-normative concept of the political, of the violence, and I do think that they accept this, but they don't say accepting this point, but they do this, and we can say this very important point when moving the introduction to on the political says that she, for her, is Carl Schmitt the most important figure. You should read this text. She emphasized this many times, but they don't say any word about this non-normative character of the political by Carl Schmitt. Mufit only says that the relationship, the connection of Carl Schmitt to Nazism is the statement of the exclusive demos. She said this is the key point in Carl Schmitt connected him with Nazism. But we can show here philologically that this exclusive demos, concept of exclusive demos, doesn't appear at all in the concept of the political. It appears later, after 33, and as sentence in the Verfassungslehre, so appears it, but in this key text, in the concept of political, he doesn't speak of the exclusive demos. But for Carl Schmitt, is the non-normative character of violence very important, and Chantal Mouffe doesn't say no word about this issue.
The first question was about the Leírás and populism. The Leírás basically endorses populism as far as, according to them, according to most of the intellectuals on the Leírás, populism is, I would say, a spark of the national spirit. According to most of the Leírás thinkers, populism is something that arises from the Volksstreut in German, those faithful to the Volk, and as such, it is something positive. On the other hand, the Leírás never intended to be connected with the masses. Quite the opposite. It's an elite movement. It's an elite movement. And some of the Leírás, especially our Italian colleague Marco Tarchi, who is one leader of the Italian Leírás, has been very critical of Italian populism from Berlusconi to Lega to even to Cinque Stelle. So there are very different attitudes within the Leírás, but what strikes me the most is the fact that most intellectuals from the Leírás, including de Benoit, see themselves as being very aloof and do not want to be concerned with the everyday life concerns of most people. I mean, they want to be true intellectuals. I mean, trying to influence politics, but they stay very far away from the everyday concerns of the average citizen. The second question was on the connection between the new right and the alt-right. So those are two really different realities. First of all, the new right, whether it be French, German, Italian, or so on, is anti-US. Everything that comes from the US, according to de Benoit, for example, is rotten to the core, simply because it emanates from the United States. Money comes from the United States. Financial power comes from the United States. Multicultural society comes from the United States. So everything that originates from the States is alien, according to them, to European culture and should be dismissed. So they do not have a very strong interest in the new right, in the alt-right, and besides, they do not want to be associated with the alt-right for the very good reason that on race issues, the alt-right is often very outspoken white supremacists, and they do not want to be associated with that. They're trying to portray themselves as mainstream, not conservatives, but mainstream people trying to influence the intellectual debate, and they do not want to be associated with the dealers in Charlottesville. And there are one or two exceptions. The first one, I think, is American Renaissance and Jared Taylor, who has very good knowledge of the French New Right for personal reasons when he was studying in Paris. De Benoit himself has been lecturing in the United States maybe 2 or 3 times in the last 10 years. So he does not know the United States, and that much. He does not want to be influential in the States. He's far more interested in Central Europe and Italy and Germany.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just for the outside audience. Thank you very much for that concludes the first part of our conference this afternoon. We are very grateful to Johnny, Eva, and Peter, and grateful to the audience for these interesting remarks and questions, and for the patience and for the participation. Now we are going to have a short coffee break, and please be here back in this room in 15 and not more than 15 minutes. Thank you very much.